Well, we're going to turn to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 21, and continue reading. We're going to read from verse 7 through to verse 17. 7 to 17. The disciples brought the donkey and colt, placed their cloaks on them, and Jesus sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" And the crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." Jesus entered the temple area and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. "It is written," he said to them, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did and the children shouting in the temple area, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. "Do you hear what these children are saying?" they asked him. "Yes," replied Jesus. "Have you never read? From the lips of children and infants you have ordained praise." And he left them. And he went out of the city to Bethany, where he spent the night. People often say to me, particularly as we approach Christmas time, how do you ever find anything new to say about it? Well, if you think Christmas is difficult, I tell you, Palm Sunday is much harder. Because at Christmas, you've got so many different angles that you can look at. I mean, there's the run-up to it. And so you've got things like the angel appearing to Mary. You've got the story of Zechariah, of course, and the naming of John. You've got, of course, the stories surrounding the angels at various stages, at different times they appeared. You've got the shepherds out in the fields. You've got the story, of course, of the wise men, as we often call them. Then you've got the things that happened immediately after the birth. You've got Jesus being presented at the temple. There's so many different angles to look at. And yet when it comes to Palm Sunday, the only thing we ever think about is Jesus going into Jerusalem with the crowds cheering and shouting and throwing their cloaks on the floor and waving the palm branches in the air, celebrating the fact that the King has come. Well, I think there's more to it than just that, because as we've seen today, actually, in fact, there are other stories surrounding this. And we've been looking over this Lent period at this series of the way to the cross. The way to the cross. And we've been following it through Matthew's Gospel from chapter 16, end of, and going through the Transfiguration in chapter 17 and various events along the way that we've seen as Jesus made that journey closer and closer. It wasn't just one journey. He went to and fro to this place and that place along the way. But it's a journey of time, I suppose, more than anything else. We believe there was about 6 months between the Transfiguration and the events that we're looking at today. But during that time, Jesus was explaining to his disciples that the end was coming, that he would have to go to Jerusalem, that there he would be arrested and eventually crucified. But of course also that he would rise from the dead once again. I don't know what the disciples understood about the journey that Jesus was talking about. But I've got a funny feeling that at this stage they were probably a little bit confused. You can imagine that in the back of their minds were thoughts of what Jesus had been saying, that he's going to become a king, yes. He's coming into his kingdom. He told his disciples that you will rule or reign with me. He says that there will be 12 thrones for you, and you will sit on these 12 thrones, and you will become judges with me of Israel. We looked at that last week. We saw how it was James and John that seized the opportunity and rushed in along with their mother, Salome, to ask Jesus for special places of honor when you come into your kingdom. Jesus never actually said no, but he did tell them that he says, you haven't a clue what you're asking. You're asking such a big thing, and you don't know what it is that will be expected of you. And now here we are, a bit further along that same journey. They've been into Jericho. Now, if you know anything of the geography of Israel, you've got Galilee in the north, Jerusalem sort of quite some distance to the south, the River Jordan that runs along the east side, and in the middle you've got this area that was occupied by another group who were half Jews, the Samaritans. And the Jews didn't really like going into Samaritan country. So rather than go from north to south direct, they would cross over the River Jordan onto the east side. They would walk down the east side of the Jordan, cross back over through Jericho, and then up a very long drag of a hill. It's an immense drag of a hill. It's amazing when they talk about Jericho being low, and it is indeed, I believe, the lowest inhabited city on earth. And Jerusalem is quite high in the hills. And I remember doing that journey and just going down the hill, and I just thought that we would never ever stop descending. It just seemed to wind on and on forever, going down, 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 till we get to the Jericho plain. Well, now they start up the hill from Jericho, but as they went through Jericho, things were happening there too, because, a couple of things happened really of note. One is, of course, that it was at this time, not that it's recorded in Matthew's Gospel and only Luke records it, but at this time, of course, Jesus met up with a little short man who was so short but wanted to see Jesus, so he climbed into a tree, Zacchaeus. And so Jesus met with Zacchaeus, and he went to his home, and there he met with Zacchaeus and other tax collectors and all sorts of people. And this man's life was completely changed as a result of meeting Jesus. Now, I can't say for sure whether Zacchaeus was in the crowd further along the road as they came into Jerusalem, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if he was there. And then, of course, Jesus met with a blind man, or maybe men, to be perhaps slightly more accurate. Mark and Luke record a single blind man. Matthew records 2 blind men. They were begging. They were on the side of the road. They had no hope in life. What could there be? They're blind. People would have thought that they had done something terribly wrong, either themselves or maybe their parents had sinned and angered God, and this was God's judgment upon them. People were kind enough perhaps to throw them the odd coin now and again. They had enough just to buy something to eat perhaps. But they were beggars. Nobody took them seriously. But it seems that these men had heard of Jesus. One of them we know from Mark's Gospel was, of course, Bartimaeus. And sometimes it's asked, how on earth does Mark manage to record his name? And in fact, of all the people that Jesus healed along the roads and the places where he went to from place to place, I think Bartimaeus is probably the only one that's actually named. But how did he do it? Well, I suspect that many years later, that Bartimaeus was probably still in the church, still a follower of Jesus. But anyway, that aside, these blind men are sitting there and they hear that Jesus is coming. Jesus of Nazareth is coming. I mean, Jesus would have been a relatively common name back then. But Jesus of Nazareth, you mean the Jesus of Nazareth? Yeah, the prophet Jesus of Nazareth is coming. And they started to shout. But it's interesting that later on when Jesus and the crowds are coming into Jerusalem and the people are asking, who is it that's coming? And these men must have asked exactly the same question. That the reply was, as I've just indicated, it's Jesus of Nazareth the prophet. But Jesus was so much more than just a prophet. I mean, yes, he was a prophet. He was a prophet in many ways. I mean, in the first place, he was the prophet in that he spoke about the future. He spoke God's plans out. He spoke the word of God direct. And in that sense, he's a prophet. He's a prophet also in the sense that he fulfilled the prophecy that Moses made, that there would be a prophet who was to come. And he was that prophet. But he's so much more than that. So much more. Jesus is the Son of God. And the amazing thing is that when these men hear that Jesus is coming, and we don't know exactly what they told him, but when they heard and they were told, Jesus of Nazareth is coming, these men began to shout, and they showed more faith than most, I think. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. Well, of course, we all know that in earthly terms at least, Jesus' father was not called David. Jesus' father in earthly terms was called Joseph. So why on earth would they say son of David? I mean, we could have turned and said to him, sorry, you've got the wrong Jesus, obviously. But no, they hadn't got the wrong Jesus. You see, these men knew that the Messiah, who is the son of David, because David was promised that there would be one who would come, a son who would come, a son who would reign on his throne, a son who would rule with justice and integrity, and a son whose kingdom would be established and last forever and ever. And when Solomon came to the throne, it quickly became obvious that Solomon was not that descendant. Solomon was a fine king. In some respects, perhaps the finest that Israel had. He was certainly a wise king. We all know about Solomon and his wisdom. He was a king who ruled with amazing skill through his wisdom. Israel enjoyed a period of peace under Solomon's time like it had not had before or after. 40 years Solomon reigned. 40 years of peace the country had. Solomon was a wealthy king. Solomon had the finest of everything. And when you actually go back and read the Old Testament accounts of Solomon's reign, it is staggering to see what Solomon had and the opulence of his reign. The amount of gold that was around the place, the finest of everything was there. Solomon built the kingdom up to an absolute height. But Solomon died. He didn't reign forever, and after 40 years he was gone and somebody else took his place. But Israel was looking constantly for another king who would come. The Messiah, as he was called, or the Christ. Messiah is a Hebrew word, Christ is a Greek word, but it's exactly the same word. And this man, or men, as they sit on the roadside and they hear that Jesus is coming, they've decided, even though they're blind, even though they cannot see for themselves what Jesus has done, just hearing was enough. The stories that had gone around about Jesus was enough for them. They weren't even in the Galilee region. Jesus did most of his ministry around Galilee. And then he came south on various occasions and he did ministry around Jerusalem and the Judean region. That's true. But we don't read of Jesus spending an awful lot of time in Jericho. And yet they had heard down there in Jericho all about this man. Surely he is the Son of David. And so they call out, Lord, or quite literally, Sir, Son of David, have mercy on us. And you see, these men, I think they express their faith again when Jesus eventually comes to speak to them. We read that the crowds were not very happy. These beggars, blind men, people who have no status whatsoever in society, outcasts as far as they were concerned, were rebuked in verse 31, it says. They told them to be quiet. You're being unseemly. You're causing a stir. Be quiet. But did that stop them? No, all the more they shout louder and louder and louder. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Now you see, when Jesus comes to them and actually speaks to them, I like the way in which Jesus asks them to speak for themselves, to say exactly what it is that they want. And you know, one of the things that we find is that Jesus, although he knows, and it was obvious to anyone, I'm sure, that when you've got two blind men shouting, have mercy on us, they must have wanted their sight back. Surely that is what it is that they were after. And yet Jesus makes them speak and say, what is it you want? If Jesus was a prophet, if he was a prophet, would he have healed them? The only prophet they had seen in recent years was John the Baptist. John the Baptist was sometimes referred to as the last of the Old Covenant prophets or the Old Testament prophets, although he's New Testament. But he comes before Jesus, who brings in the New Covenant. And the thing that was noted about John was that John was a man who never performed any miracles. Not one. John spoke the truth, it says, about Jesus. Everything that John said about Jesus was true. Therefore we believe John, the people said. But when it comes to actually doing miracles, nobody went to John and said, John, heal my sight. John, help me to walk again. John, give me my hearing back. Nobody ever said that to John. These men didn't believe that Jesus was a prophet. They were fully convinced this is the Messiah. And when Messiah comes, he is the Lord himself. He will do great and wonderful things. He will take up our infirmities, heal all our diseases and sicknesses. They knew all of that. What do you want me to do for you? Lord, we want our sight. We want our sight. having had compassion on them and healing them, it says they followed Jesus along the road. I think that's a bit of an understatement. Luke tells us that they followed praising God. Can you blame them? But you know, it's just so amazing to me that it was the blind men who really saw Jesus for who he was. So say later on, as Jesus is entering in, the crowds are shouting and cheering, and indeed they're speaking of the Son of David there. It's interesting again, isn't it, that it's the children. Those for whom we think, you know, they might not know too much, they might not understand fully. But the children it was that were singing and shouting. Among others, of course. From the lips of children and infants, you have ordained praise. So Jesus reminds the religious leaders, quoting Psalm 8. We notice that when Jesus came into the temple, having gone through that triumphal procession, he goes in there and he cleanses the temple. He clears out those greedy money changers. Nothing's changed. Tourism is always the same, isn't it? Exploiting people, overcharging them. The money changers were there because people would come into the temple from all over the known world. They would come in with their various currencies, but there were certain taxes or certain gifts and offerings made in the temple that you couldn't make with your own local currency. It had to be with the currency that was acceptable to the temple. So you have money changers. So you can go into the temple with your pound notes and hand them over and get back your money that you need for the temple. The thing is, the exchange rate was really out of balance. These people were doing wonders with it. And then, having got your money, of course, you might want to make an offering, a sacrifice, so to go and get a dove. And so there were people selling the doves there. And whereas, of course, anywhere else a dove would be, you know, a penny or two each, here they were, you know, at least double the price. But people would pay the price anyway. That's tourism. And Jesus says, this place that should have been for prayer has become a place of robbers. It's all about commerce, but much more than that. It's about dishonest business. Thus he chases them out of the temple. And it seems to me that here again we have another group of people. Here we have the religious leaders now, who haven't recognized who Jesus is. Notice what they say. When they hear the children shouting in the temple area, more people were being healed. Notice that in verse 14. The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. The chief priests and the teacher of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple area, Hosanna to the Son of David. They were indignant. They hadn't recognized who Jesus was. Men of the greatest learning in Israel did not recognize Jesus. The crowds who had walked with Jesus did not recognize him as Messiah fully. He's a prophet. But blind men who could not see, who had not met Jesus, had their eyes opened spiritually before their eyes were opened physically. Children, so innocent as they were, had recognized that Jesus was the Messiah long before they had matured and could have understood it fully. The innocence of children is a wonderful thing. Children take things at face value. So often we can tell children things and, you know, that they'll just believe whatever you tell them. no matter how outlandish it may sound. But that's what happens. That's why we get away with bizarre stories about a man dressed in red coming at Christmas and coming down chimneys that most of us no longer have. But when you tell children the truth, even at a young age, they also believe that too. And that's why we have a great opportunity. I mean, it's wonderful today. I don't think I've seen so many children in church for a long time. But it's wonderful to have that opportunity to be able to tell them the truth. They may not have thought it all through. They may not have worked out things for themselves. But even from a young age, they will pick up on that. They will take it and they will believe it as truth. Okay, there may come a time when they want to question it more. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not suggesting that doubting it is a bad thing, but questioning our faith is good. So why do I believe what I believe? That kind of questioning. To know why I believe this. That's a good thing. But here the children very innocently just keep praising and praising and praising. And even they can see the simple things. There was a man who was blind and now he can see. There was a man who couldn't walk and now he's jumping and leaping around. That's exciting. Jesus was showing very clearly, without question, he is the King. He is the Messiah. He is the one who has come to claim his throne. Those disciples who had been told that they would reign with Jesus when he came into his kingdom, I don't know quite what they thought was going to happen. Whether Herod's palace was next going to be overthrown or not, I don't know. Whether then they would have their thrones set up and they would sit on those, but they were mistaken. Jesus is saying that I want you to see that I am the King. And I come in humility. My task is not yet finished. Rather than coming in grandeur, on horses and triumphal processions, he comes humbly on a donkey. Rather than coming with aggression to conquer, he comes as one willingly to give himself up. Because he knows that the rules of the kingdom are different to the rules on earth. If you want to be great in the kingdom, Jesus told his disciples last week, then you have to become the servant. If you want to become the king, you also have to become the servant. You have to humble yourself completely. Jesus knew that. Jesus knew that there was no good coming into Jerusalem to take it with force. He was coming humbly because his work was not finished. He had to go all the way to the cross. How events were about to change. And in that coming week, things would change beyond recognition. The disciples would find themselves having their minds twisted around as they couldn't understand what was going on. This Jesus they thought had come to rule and to conquer was now in a tomb. How did that happen? The praising of the children and the peoples and the waving of the palm branches was long silent. As the people said, maybe he wasn't anything after all. And so we go through this coming week. And as you read through the scriptures, an awful lot happened in that week. I encourage you to read through the scriptures, read through the story. Even just from Matthew's gospel, that would be a good thing to do, to just go through day by day from Matthew chapter 21 right through until we get to Matthew 27, the crucifixion. Read through it. See the things that happened. See how the mood changes. See how faith was shaken. And ask yourself this question, that you have the benefit of hindsight, of course. But ask yourself this question, what shakes your faith? what shakes your faith? And what makes your faith stand firm? Because if your faith is built on anything other than the revelation that Jesus is the Messiah, then your faith will be shaken. If you believe wholeheartedly, without a shadow of doubt, that Jesus is indeed who he said he was, that he is the King of Kings, that his death on the cross was for you, that his resurrection brings you life, then no matter what you face, you can say, I don't care what comes around, what is said, what things I go through. Ultimately, my faith will hold me firm. It cannot shake me. Let's pray.